it's weird because it sounds like it all just like happened, and in a way, like what that ignores is how messy it was at the time.
Every once in a while, I have someone on the show and I realize we could connect every single week for the podcast and never run out of things to talk about. And that is the case with today's guest. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. And today's guest is Jason Haaheim, who is the principal timpanist for the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra and has a super cool backstory that he has talked about on several other podcasts, which I have linked up to, namely Noah Kageyama's wonderful Bulletproof Musician podcast. If you don't listen to that, I don't want to say turn off this podcast and go listen to that, but definitely subscribe to that and listen to that. And we've got Jason's appearances on that podcast, so definitely check that out. Jason has, we'll call it an unconventional path to his job in the MET Orchestra. He didn't go to music school. He got a PhD and worked for 10 years as an engineer and researcher for a nanotech startup in Chicago, where he ended up playing a bunch of gigs with my wife and me. We were Chicago freelancers in the mid-2000s. It's just such a small world. We all did Civic together. He did my wife and me, although none of us overlapped. So we talk about that. But what we really dig into is how Jason got his job with the Met, which was using something called deliberate practice, which if you've listened to this podcast for any length of time, you know I've been really into for the last few years. I spoke with Mark Gelfo of Modacity, the wonderful app that I use each and every day, and that is focused on deliberate practice. Ever since discovering that app, I've been really into the topic. I actually used some of Jason's articles for a talk I was doing at a music education conference, and we got connected kind of sort of through that, and wow, you are going to love this conversation. I guarantee you. It is everything I love about having a show like this. So let's dig in. But just right before we dig in, I have a podcast promo for my good friend, Andrew Harmon, fellow bassist, lives in Portland, Oregon, and he's starting a new podcast called Citizens of Jobland. So we'll run that promo and then we'll get right into our conversation with Jason Haaheim.
Who exactly is an essential worker? From full-time employees to part-timers, temps, freelancers, and members of the gig economy, they're all the subject of Citizens of Jobland, a new podcast launching this summer. The show explores jobs you may never have heard of, non-traditional career paths, and compelling journeys to success. We'll talk to everyday, exceptional people about what they do, the doors that open for them, advice for job seekers, and much more. So instead of asking who is an essential worker, Citizens of Jobland says, well, who isn't?
Generally, I don't like opening up my email. It's nothing but the world's to-do list for me. But but every once in a while, it's like, oh my goodness, So this is man, have you thought about starting a podcast? I just got to ask right up front.
It's funny. Maybe, yeah. It's like one of those things I've kind of had on some sort of burner, some sort of iron, and some sort of fire for a while. Honestly, there've just been a lot of these projects where during the Met season and the before times, it was like, okay, this is like totally impossible with this sort of lack of bandwidth and the amount of playing we do and everything. And now that like the world has changed, I'm like, maybe,
Well, I just get you're every once in a while that you're like the perfect podcast guest. Not to jinx it for us, but like both. I love doing research. I mean, part of why I like, when I'm sure you can relate to this with your background, and so one of the things I always do before I chat with someone is, have they been on podcasts? And the answer is yes, you have. So I think the first one I listened to was Musicality Now with Christopher, I think, which is a lot of fun. And then he mentioned Bulletproof Musician, so I went on. But Noah had just had you on again, so I listened to both of those. And it's just super interesting. So I'll link up to all of that. But man,
fantastic.
You are just like, it's just everything you say resonates so strongly with me, and it's like super interesting. And so yeah.
Likewise, man. Yeah.
Oh, but I mean, like you're the. By the way, maybe we've already started. I have no idea. I just get on and chat, and I'm sure. But anything you want to edit out, it's totally not live. But it's you should start a podcast. I would listen to every single episode. It's just really It's one of my favorite topics. And I think who connected me to you was Mark Gelfo. Do you and Mark, have you been in touch?
Oh, wait. Yeah. Hold on. How do I know Mark?
He has this practice app, Modacity.
Yes, that's where I know it from. Yep.
Okay, I don't know if you've been in touch, but I was hanging out with Mark. He's here in the Bay Area, and he said, "Oh, you should read Jason's material," and so I got into it, and I love your writing style, and then I also you're great on the podcast too. It's equally interesting. So
thanks, man.
Start a podcast. I'll be your first subscriber.
All right. I'm going to take that.
Now so I spent some time with Rob Knopper maybe 4 years ago. He was here in San Francisco. I remember we went paper shopping of all things. He found some like really kind of boutique paper place that he was really into. But he was talking about how he intentionally waited until he had tenure or for a certain period of time in the Met before he really got going with things. Did you have kind of a similar mindset? Like you just wanted to like do the job before you started writing and just get settled?
Yeah, and honestly, I don't even think it was that conscious. It was just more sort of like by necessity.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Like, because for anyone listening, it may not be intuitively obvious, like the difference between playing in an opera orchestra versus a symphonic orchestra. But I mean, there's two huge points on that. First is that just like quantifiably, most major symphonic orchestras do like 700 service hours per season or so. I know this because for other projects, I've like actually gone into the contracts and calculated it up. But, so San Francisco Symphony, Chicago, New York Philharmonic, they all do roughly the same service hours. And that's, generally in a 52-week season. So that includes, Blossom and Tanglewood and Ravinia and all of those things, right? And at the Met, we do about 1,200 service hours between September and May. And if you ask how that's possible, it's because operas are freaking long and like we have to rehearse a lot of that stuff, right? So there's just like the time drain just by the hour is like dramatic. And so, even if I had wanted to or felt like I had any of the ideas sort of like maturing, I don't think I would have been physically capable of it in the first couple seasons. And then sort of beyond that and related to it is that, I think it's safe to say that people who win jobs in symphonic orchestras can safely, like their colleagues can safely assume that they will have at least become familiar with a lot of the core rep. When you win a job in the New York Philharmonic, like you are at least peripherally familiar with all the Brahms symphonies and Mahler and Shostakovich and, all this stuff. Like if you haven't fully played it, you maybe played it in school or studied it or, something like that. And that's just not the case at the Met, right? Like it kind of can't be because there's just not enough other opera orchestras out there where you would have had a chance to sub or freelance or anything like that. Right. Like, man, you played in lyric.
Yeah. Well,
you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, it's hilarious. I remember back at Northwestern, my bass teacher, Michael Hovnanian, they were doing Electra. They were doing a staged version of Electra. Chicago Symphony. And he's just like, check this out, guys. He like brought the bass part in. And we're like, oh, it's like Ein Heldenleben, but it's the size of a novel. Yeah. And I remember so clearly playing in lyric, playing Rosenkavalier. And I'm staring at the clock on the wall and it's like 7:30, 8:30. 9:30, 10:30, 11:30, so 11:45, depending on if it was the guest conductor. So yeah, I mean the quantity of music is just it's insane, and it's still as a pond or utter panic, on licks you've never seen that are as hard as anything in the So it's monumental.
One of my favorite things is like we have a pretty like tight group of timpanists at Lincoln Center between me and my co-principal timpanist Parker Lee, Stephen White, the assistant timpanist, Marcus Roten at the Philharmonic, and then his assistant Kyle Zerna. And like we all hang out and we get drinks and eat dinner and whatnot. And so sometimes like they'll be finishing like a heavy week. It's like Friday night, and they're texting me at like 9:45. They're like, dude. Oh, we just finished Mahler 9. Like, what a haul. Oh, and I'm like Cool. Yeah, so I've been playing Parsifal since 6 p.m. and we're not even in Act 3 yet, So there's the quantity, and then there's just like imagine winning a job in a symphonic orchestra, and in your first season, like needing to learn from scratch all of the Beethoven symphonies and Brahms and Mahler and Sibelius and Tchaikovsky and Dvorak and all the Strauss tone poems and Stravinsky. Like all of that is just brand new. That's what the first couple seasons are like at the Met.
Yeah.
And that's again sort of not even factoring in yet what you mentioned about the pond, the still pond versus the panic. Like there's just so many ways to catastrophically embarrass yourself in opera.
Yeah.
Did you do Bohème at Lyric?
I did not do Bohème at Lyric. No, I did Traviata backstage, which is my favorite gig ever. It's like you could put your flashers on and run in and play,
Yeah. Well, Bohème is a funny example because it's one of it's basically like our Beethoven 5. It's like such a core piece of rep. I think the Met has done it maybe more than any other opera in our repertoire since like 1870 or something, whatever like that. And so, for the people that have been there long enough, you can basically play it in your sleep. Which means that, because it's such a standard, it very rarely gets rehearsed. But it's actually really tricky. Like the first time you get into it, that first page just goes right by, and you see the conductor, and it's like in this faster, and like 90 seconds later, you're already on page 2. And you're like, oh my God, what's happening? And then you get to a measure that's like nominally in 4/4, but it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, roll. And you're like, where am I? And so, I mean, everybody that plays at the Met, that plays in our orchestra, has some experience where in their first season or two, they just step in a big fat hole, and everybody has a good laugh because it's like, I've been there. And, there, but for the grace of whatever musical power go I, right?
Right.
So that's a long answer to your question, but there was a lot of that to kind of wrap my head around in the first few seasons.
Well, especially when you're playing, I mean, the advantage of subbing in on bass is you can definitely take a when in doubt, leave it out kind of attitude, because you have other colleagues. My wife, actually, her essay for medical school was about an experience she had getting called. She's played in Lyric a lot on harp, harpist turned radiology, academic radiology.
I think she needs to have a podcast.
Yeah, I know. I would be the one producing it, so I don't know if I want that responsibility. That would be the but she so she got called to sub for Madame Butterfly the day of. And it was snowing heavily in Chicago, and they wanted her in that night. So she gets on the freeway. She played Madame Butterfly in the Des Moines Metro Opera, 5 years before with a different conductor, obviously. So she was going down, not going to be her harp, not going to be her part, how the pedal, and just that, and opera, as you obviously know so well, listeners may not, but it's all about not maintaining a steady tempo for the most part. Everything's slowing down or speeding up, or there's the fermata just like you described, or maybe it's going to be on this, and then obviously you're working with singers. So she said that was one of the highs were so high and the lows were so low in that performance. She was so thrilled when she nailed it, and then it was in 4 instead of in 2, and like these looks of confusion from the conductor, and that was but that was like her performing under pressure story, that she got into a bunch of good schools with that. So
oh man, it's a great story. And I mean, and that's another part of it too, is that like the there's like a linearity to symphonic orchestra playing, which is like, here's our week, here's the program, here's this conductor. It's just not like that in opera companies, and like specifically at the Met, it's not like that, because we will often have situations where we're doing a run of Bohèmes again, for instance, and there's going to be 18 in the given season, but it's broken up into 3 chunks. It's like fall, winter, spring, and each run has a different cast and conductor. And so we'll get like maybe 1 pit rehearsal in September with cast 1 and conductor number 1. And then that runs through like early October, and then it stops. And then we show up again for performance number 7 in December, and it's a different conductor and different cast. And maybe the most apt analogy for me is like an opera orchestra reminds me of like a flock of birds like darting around together very quickly, and then like, you know, like a predator comes in and they go the other way, and but like you have to respond together well and quickly, because you just never know what's going to get thrown at you. And as you know, we're often going on 0 rehearsal.
It's such a people who haven't played in opera orchestras might not realize what a different job it seems. I remember having that like cup of coffee at like 10 p.m. You know, in the second intermission or something like that. And it's like, man, this is like working class kind of, you know, the longest symphonic concert is about as long as the shortest opera, typically, you know, like Rheingold or something like that. And there are some shorter, but it's just such a different animal in terms of I remember talking to who was it? Lee Mesh? Maybe I was talking to Lee about who his first season at the Met, he had broken his leg in some sort of skiing
He's probably
accident.
Mountain biking or skiing. Something
like that. And like,
love that guy, by the way.
Yeah. He's a hoot. And I was talking to him about just like maintaining concentration, but he said that first season was particularly weird because he was in this like big cast trying to play bass with a cast sticking out. It's
no joke. Yeah. I mean, like I found in the first couple of seasons, it really forced me to like reorient parts of my life, which is like, you know, you play one of these 6-hour operas like Meistersinger, Parsifal, Götter Dämmerung, one of these things. And it's not like when you get home at like 12:45 in the morning, you just go right to bed. You've just been performing for 6 hours. Like a lot of my colleagues feel this way. You're like, you're tired, but you're also just like amped and you're wired and you're like, and you probably had espresso at like 11:15, you know? So then you have to have kind of like this weird cool down, like wind down process that, you know, it might involve a cocktail. It might involve reading a book or listening to a podcast or, you know, playing some, you know, Nintendo Switch online with your friends, like whatever that is. But then you end up like getting to bed at like 3:30 or 4 in the morning. And that's just like a normal day.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's absolutely wild.
It's such a different lifestyle. I remember talking to Liz Schifani, who is the harp professor at Northwestern and longtime harpist in lyric opera. And she said that there was and I know the season's different for lyric versus the Met, so it's a different animal. But at this point, I think lyric was 26 weeks or somewhere there. And so she said because she had to live the life you're describing. That's just how most human. I mean, I can't fall asleep the second I walk in the door. And if you're getting out of work around midnight a lot of the time and then getting home, you're waking up at 10 a.m. at the earliest. I mean, you're like a stand-up comedian or something in terms of your schedule. And then just the recovery. She said that she would kind of like go into a little bit of a hibernation in terms of other things in her life during that season because it was just so much focus and just so much time. And then she had her life not when the lyric season was happening. But I know that the Met is much more what's the season in terms of weeks in the year typically?
Right. So typically we start our preseason rehearsals in the beginning of September, usually right after Labor Day. And there's 3 weeks of preseason where we're just rehearsing all the stuff, like basically turning on the machine and like getting everything ready to go. And then once opening night happens, we are doing 7 performances a week of typically 4 different operas. And we do that for 33 straight weeks. And then there's a post season, which usually includes our like symphonic concerts at Carnegie Hall and you know, tours and stuff like that. Which is, again, very interesting because we hit that part of the season and everyone's like, oh, finally we're on vacation. We can just play a Schumann symphony or something. You know what I mean? Like it's a really, and because the whole feeling of your life changes. Like once you kind of step off that, like, you know, rapidly moving kind of hamster wheel conveyor belt situation, you like downshift and you're like, oh, okay. All right.
So we have a lot in common.
Right.
And it's funny. So I'm going to go, if that's okay. I never do this, but I've been listening to you. I feel like I'm listening to a podcast. I guess I am listening to a podcast. It's one that's happening in real time. But so you grew up in suburban Minneapolis.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And I grew up in
Chaska, Minnesota.
Okay. I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So my nearest big city was Minneapolis. I'd come in and take lessons with one of the Minnesota Orchestra bassists, James Clute, who had these two large dogs. And it seems like every bass player I talked to seems to have had some encounter with Clute. And then you went to, I forget if it's St. Olaf or Gustavus Adolphus. I always confuse the two schools in my mind. But which one?
Gustavus.
Okay, Gustavus.
And actually, my friend Matt McClung, he's another percussionist and timpanist. He just started teaching at St. Olaf, and I was like, "How dare you?" Because we're it's like the Midwest liberal arts college sort of faux rivalry. Yeah. Like everyone is so like passive and tame, but we like to pretend that we're like bitter rivals between the Norwegians and the Swedes. But yeah, I went to Gustavus.
Okay, I remember when I was in high school, those were, if you were in choir and were serious about music, those were the two schools you were looking at. It seems like, and then UC Santa Barbara, right? Yep. Okay, and PhD. Right.
So what happened is I got accepted for the PhD program because, and it's still like this in many of the hard science programs. Like if you go in for a PhD, it's not only free, but they'll pay you to be there.
Yeah, right.
But the bargain is it doesn't work that way for a master's degree, because for a PhD, the sort of the contract, so to speak, is that you get your degree for free and they'll pay you to be there, but in the first couple of years, you're basically just taking classes and learning the stuff. And then years like 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 even, you're working for your advisor. Like you are doing research and publishing papers that are sort of part of that scientist's working group. They're all kind of like fiefdoms, right? So they have this like little empire of research, and you become one of the research workers, and you're doing it, for much lower cost than it would be to hire out somebody. And so that's how you can make that happen financially. So what I did is I got in there on this fellowship and was like, hey, this is a pretty sweet deal. But it was partway through that I was like, oh boy, like I don't really think my heart is in this. And luckily I had a really great advisor that was like, look, if you need to leave, you do what you got to do, like no hard feelings. And that was kind of amazing.
Was it hard to leave Santa Barbara? Because as someone who is from essentially where you're from, I was fascinated by the concept of palm trees. I just couldn't imagine a world, and like Santa Barbara is pretty sweet. And even if you're working, if it's not the ideal situation, like, man, that is and to go back, because Chicago was then where you went
Chicago
for the startup, the nanotech startup. Was it hard to what was just your experiences from one Midwestern roots person to another? Like, was it hard to leave California? Or
but I'll say this: if you're anything like me, growing up in the Midwest almost necessarily gives you like a streak of masochism.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, maybe I'll put it this way. Since living in New York, I've kind of been like, what happened to winter?
Yeah.
Like New York winters are bullshit. They're just like 35, 40 degrees, rainy all the time. And I'm like, come on, give me 10 degrees and snow. I want to get out there and be like cross country skiing and like doing this stuff. So like, obviously Santa Barbara is totally on the opposite end of that. I mean, you've heard my other podcasts and like my blog posts. I'm always nerding out on stuff. So for me, like the analogy is in the Lord of the Rings, where they have like the undying lands in the West. Mm-hmm. To me, that was like Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is like the undying land. Somehow, like everyone there has had plastic surgery. They all look like ageless. There's just this whole like Southern California vibe that is like time doesn't move because every day is beautifully the same.
Yeah.
Which I kind of loved. And then after a while, I was kind of like, this is weird. This doesn't feel, there's something about it that just like wasn't completely vibing with my like Midwestern masochism.
Yeah.
So it was like basically a beautiful place to live and study for a few years, but like, I don't know that I could have like settled there long term, but then again, we'll see what the next few years look like.
Right. No, it's been funny being someone who the first 40 years of my life were in either South Dakota or Chicago, which I had a similar experience to what you're describing with New York. I thought I was moving to the tropics, moving to Chicago from South Dakota. It's like, what? The snow doesn't fall in early October and remain until sometime in April. And that sense of nothing ever changing I have grown used to it. I've grown quite soft. I would be very disappointed. Past Jason would be very disappointed with the current Jason. And to like have it be, but it's funny. The first 6 months I lived in San Francisco, I was still like palm trees. Wow. And now it's fine. I don't even see them. I don't even notice, but it is weird to have everything be just like exactly the same. All the time.
To be fair though, I do like the Bay Area has a little bit more variation than Southern California.
A little more. Yeah. Definitely. But not as much as Chicago or certainly Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Or International Falls in northern Minnesota where it gets down to like negative 60 degrees.
So what year did you come to Chicago?
2003.
Okay. So, and you came for the nanotech job, but you also played in Civic at some point, right?
Yeah. So that took a little while because I had the job offer first and it was attractive for a number of reasons, but, definitely in the back of my mind, I was like, well, Chicago's a great city to move to because there's all kinds of like great players there I can study with. I know I need to up my game. And as I'm doing that, I can at least try to get into Civic because I know that's like this, like New World or Orchestra now, it's like this training bridging opportunity so I can kind of get in there and hone my thing. And, so I think I auditioned that first fall, didn't even get close. Then I auditioned again and I got the associate spot, which in Civic, it's sort of like it's like a contracted sub, basically. And that was lucky because I wouldn't have gotten it, but then this other guy like moved away or something. So I like moved up into it. I was like, all right, cool. And then the principal timpanist also after, didn't complete his full term and then also quit. So then I got like elevated into the principal chair and I was like, well, isn't this lucky? And then I re-auditioned after that and sort of like won it outright. But so I sort of got to enjoy an unusually long time in Civic, which was really good and really necessary for me because I was coming from such a like late starting point, and it really took me a while to kind of get up to speed. So it was interesting. So I was in Civic from 98 to 2000, and that was when Barenboim was still music director, and it was before he'd gotten into his East-West the program in Palestine and Israel, and he was really focused on building up Civic, which he then became less interested in Civic, and it sort of changed a little bit. It had a rough year where it became a chamber orchestra, but I was in it when we did a week-long residency in New York, played at Carnegie multiple times. Yeah, it was a cool time to be in it. Then my wife, so you missed both of us in Civic. My wife was in it from like 2002 to 2004 or something like that. Right, we just barely missed each other. Yeah.
So the nanotech job must have at least been somewhat flexible in terms of the hours, or was it? Because I'm just picturing, as I was listening to you on Noah's podcast and Christopher Podcast, I was just thinking how stinking busy, just like and obviously we're going to talk about practicing, but just without practicing at all, like that. How flexible was the day job in terms of?
Yeah, good question.
Hours?
Well, so first of all, it was fortunate that I maybe this wasn't like this when you were in Civic, but by the time I got in, all of the rehearsals were weekday evenings or like weekend afternoons.
You know what? I guess that was, it's been so long ago, I've forgotten what their schedule was like. So
yeah, well, and I think they did it that way by design because they realized, they didn't have the budget to match New World. Mm-hmm. You couldn't go and only do Civic. Right. So like the people when I was in Civic that were doing it, like there was a big draw from like the local Chicago schools, Northwestern and DePaul and Roosevelt. And then other people would like move in from out of state to do it. But all of them like had to be doing something else. Like people were waiting tables, people had paralegal work, it was a whole mix of things. And so I think acknowledging that, the administrators of Civic were like, yeah, we need to make it possible for people to do these other things to support themselves. And so, I was one of many people that had some sort of day job. It's just that mine was at a somewhat different level of like, technical whatever. But yeah, so that made it much more workable.
Okay. That's a lot. So when I was in Civic, I was doing my master's at Northwestern, and they had a string fellowship program, which may or may not still exist, but it's free school, essentially. And then I was principal-based, so I got a stipend for that, for whatever reason, for doing Boeings, I guess. But
right.
I remember having my school day and then driving down, and then driving back. It's a lot of time. Where was the nanotech job? Was it in Chicago proper?
Yeah, it started off. We had a couple different locations, but the first one was at 1335 West Randolph Street. So basically just outside the Loop.
Okay.
And so I mentioned, when I first moved there, I lived in Rogers Park. And I would take the Purple Line Express down to the Loop, transfer over Green Line, boom, to Ashland, and basically hop right off. And that was cool. I mean, that time in Chicago was really interesting because things had not nearly gentrified to the point that they are now. The West Loop was just starting to become kind of interesting and hip, and there was a cool sandwich shop where we would go, and one day I walked in and there was this big hulking dude in front of me, and I realized it was Billy Corgan, and I was like, oh. What's up, dude? I guess you like roast beef sandwiches too. Nice. So that was that for a couple of years. And then the company moved up into this kind of prefabbed science technology park at the intersection of Oakton and Skokie Boulevard.
Okay. Yeah. By the channel, the North Shore Channel.
Yep. And right by the grocery store right there. There's this whole kind of complex there.
Sure.
And that was nice because that was actually, by that time I had my house at Foster and Cicero. And so it was kind of just a straight shot up Cicero and Skokie Boulevard to get to work. I could bike there in 10, 15 minutes. So that was awfully convenient for that.
And that's a good place for doing work too, because you have freeway access. You can still get into the city reasonably easily, especially if it's a good traffic time. And having the house, I'm assuming, because another question was practicing. So you had room for timpani at your place.
This is a thing that percussionists and timpanists all eventually collide with, right? You get out of school and then it's oh no, what the hell? How am I, and I think all musicians deal to some extent with the you're out of school and now you're in this perilous time period where you're kind of cut loose and it's just you got to be self-directed. Everything is now up to you. But for us, it's this particular logistical challenge because often the instruments you own are minimal. You might own a snare drum, you own a bunch of sticks and stuff, and a couple accessories like tambourines and triangles, but you don't own a full set of timpani when you graduate from school. So I had my plan was while I was in Civic, I was kind of formulating this okay, I'm going to need to buy some timpani, which means I'm going to have a place to play them, which, okay, so I can get this reasonably affordable house. That the intersection you mentioned, Foster and Cicero, was great because I can get on the expressway in all directions. I can get to gigs quickly. It all worked out pretty well. I did this really fun rehab project with my dad where we gutted the back room of the house and put in double doors so I could get the drums in and out. And then had a garage made that had two garage doors on either side. So I could just back my minivan up to the house and load the drums in and, drive them out to, Madison or something like that. But yeah, it took some planning to pull that off. And it's a tricky thing for everybody in the percussion world.
Yeah. Well, you got so some pieces are coming together that make sense because I was trying to figure out how were you fitting in that practice time, and I always had some stupid commute that was just untenable. We were living in Hyde Park for a little while, and I was teaching. I taught orchestra for 7 years, trying to figure out what to do, taking auditions, not getting anywhere, growing frustrated, investing all that emotion in it, which is something that you talked about that I loved. I don't remember which podcast, but you talking about how you were in a position where you could the stakes were different than people who felt like they had to win the next job or they wouldn't be you had a full-time job, you were making a living, and I'm putting words in your mouth, but the sentiment I remember is that your game could kind of be infinite because you were enjoying the improvement process. You maybe putting pressure on yourself in a different way than a lot of people. I'm just thinking about myself in the mid 2000s. It's like every audition I seem to do worse than the last. And I think I was just investing. I was just trying to like do the opposite of deliberate practice, right? This like emotional, panicky practice, thinking about dollars and cents and all that. And you kind of had a different perspective.
Oh man,
right?
Totally. And it's funny because like, even when I hear myself now on some of these podcasts and like whatever, like it's weird because it sounds like it all just like happened. And in a way, like what that ignores is how messy it was at the time.
Yeah.
And like how much I was just like stumbling and failing and like just did not have any sense of what I was doing. And so like, in retrospect, I can see much more clearly what was going on. Mm-hmm. I can see that I was starting to like implement a lot of these attributes of deliberate practice. And that's, you know, the whole big thing we can get into. And, you know, what I just recently wrote that blog post about, because I had been collaborating with Anders Ericsson and recently, right, within the last couple of years, I've been collaborating with him until he died tragically. And, you know, he's sort of like the intellectual father of this entire field. And I got to tell him like, man, like your research as a scientist had this incredibly powerful and direct impact on my life.
How
you know,
cool.
And just
How
like
cool.
Right. It was amazing. And, you know, because I had worked in this other area of science, it's really rare for that to happen. You know, like scientists, best case scenario, you do something that like becomes part of this larger knowledge base that like 20 or 40 or 100 years later becomes something impactful for people. It's rare that it's like, hey, we just, you know, figured out this set of working principles that can like change your life this week, you know. But which is all to say, like, yeah, go back to like 2006, 7, 8, when I was like just starting to kind of piece some of this stuff together. And you know, like one of the things I talked about with Anders is that and I will call him that instead of Dr. Ericsson, because he was like a just super charming guy. And anytime he'd be like, well, Professor Ericsson, he's like, no, just call me Anders. Anytime we would be talking about this, we were talking about how like the sort of framework that he uncovered by interviewing and studying people, you know, who were doing expert level performance in all kinds of different fields, from music to chess to golf and tennis and, you know, heart surgery and just everything, that they kind of had this same common working model. But what like some of his writing and some of the other books about it haven't gotten into so much is what I try to put first anytime I do a masterclass or a seminar or like working with students. And that is sort of this like philosophical disposition that you're starting with, because it's exactly what you were just saying. And it took me a while to figure it out. But like, I do think way too many people approach this like, oh my God, my life depends on this. And like, oh, but for the outcome of this. And it's this very like emotional, soul shredding process. And it was in retrospect that I realized like, I thought I was going into these timpani auditions with this, you know, profound disadvantage and like such an underdog because I got such a late start. And like all these other people had been like, you know, shedding this stuff for years and like, oh my God, what was I ever going to do? But that was neglecting this other really powerful advantage that I had, which was that I could just keep going with it as long as I needed to. You know, like my auditioning efforts had no expiration date because I was set up for this long game. You know, I had access to a house and timpani and I could play and I was freelancing and I was happy, you know, and I could just keep turning that crank. And if nothing else, sort of just like hope to eventually win by attrition. You know, like it's just, I'm like, well, I'll just outlast y'all. Right. And, you know, and I suppose in the same breath, I should say this, like, I think we need to acknowledge, especially now, you know, only 6 weeks after I was watching my hometown of Minneapolis on fire with, you know, the George Floyd protests and everything. It's just been very much more on my mind that, like, I was really, really lucky and really fortunate and privileged in this whole like route that I had. Right. And it's, I think, it can be difficult to parse because on the one hand, one of the fundamental messages of deliberate practice is that innate talent is essentially just a myth. That like, you know, these how much expertise you can accrue, what level of expert performance you can attain is really up to your own crafting of your own potential, how much work you want to put in and how smart you are about it. Now, that doesn't guarantee success, right? And like Ericsson was very, very clear about that. He's like, success is a loaded word. It means different things to different people. There's a lot of statistics involved. Like, who knows how this is going to work out? But like, you pursue deliberate practice long enough and you will get much, much, much better. But like, even though innate talent might be a myth, like, does that mean everyone has a fair shot in this? And I think we can all categorically at this point say, like, no, like, of course not. Absolutely not. Right. Like, I've had some really thoughtful people comment on blog posts and different interviews I've done. And, you know, had this kind of heartbreaking exchange with this one student who was like, yeah, that, you know, this all sounds great, but like, I live in this town of like 100 people in the middle of Appalachia, and I don't have an instrument and my parents can't afford lessons. What am I supposed to do? And I'm like, dude, I'm so sorry. Like, this is a broken country. I don't have a good answer for you. Like, there's this moment where like the rubber hits the road of, you know, how can we pursue this craft? And the reality is that there is just a bare minimum level of resources you need to be able to do it. And like, way too many people don't have access to that. And it's just, it's a tragedy. And we're like living through this very visceral time of seeing it right now.
It's something I've thought about that so much in terms of being a string player, where you have this you know, there are people who have families that is usually where it comes from, that can afford to get $100,000 bass or more than that, right? And that's, you know, so you're playing on a work of art, you know, and well, sure, that's certainly not everything, but at a very high level, when you get into those detail levels that you've talked about, the you know, the gradations, you know, that is a factor. And so just like the resources are really troubling in terms of that. But, you know, it's one of your colleagues, Dan Kreckler. I found
another Minnesota guy.
Yeah, and he and I were in Civic together, and he was somebody who I found to be so inspired, because Dan was grinding it out. He was working a day job playing Civic, like you're describing, and then moved to New York at a certain point, and then all of a sudden Dan started to be advancing. I was like, oh look, Dan's advanced, and then he got a job in the Met, and he was always a fine player, but he had obviously, and I interviewed him. I've essentially had two podcasts. I had one back in the mid 2000s, and I have like the last 5 years, but they're only connected because I'm the same person. But I talked to Dan in those early days, so it sounds like AM radio or something. But I remember him talking about his path, and it's like Dan figured something out, and I'm guessing that something was likely deliberate practice. But it's so cool. You mentioned you know, like 20 years of practice, but the first 17 didn't really move the needle. And then it was those right? Yeah.
Well, and yeah, to be clear, I mean, for anyone listening to this, it's not like fairy dust, right? Again, it's not like you uncork something and all of a sudden it's like, oh, my natural gifts come out. Like one of the leading sort of ideas that Ericsson developed behind deliberate practice is that, you know, like the idea of innate gifts or innate talent is just sort of flawed in its concept. Mm-hmm. And that really, you know, what I discovered and what Dan Kreckler discovered, and really like what so many people either consciously or unconsciously stumble into, is just a way of working, a way of practicing, a way of thinking about it. And specifically, like a core tenet of that idea is that there's like no quick fixes. You know, it is a long process. It is laborious. It is, you know, there's a lot of like honesty and introspection and like self-critique that's involved with this. You know, it's not the kind of thing where there's some like, hey, here's 5 simple, you know, tricks to win your next audition. Right. You'll never believe. Click now. You know, it's exactly. Like, no, that's just like bullshit clickbait. Like, no, that's nobody has a formula for this. That's not a thing. Right. Like, and so instead, what you've got is this orientation toward the craft, which is recognizing, these attributes of deliberate practice, which, when you really put them all together, you break it down. And I have this thing I go through at masterclasses frequently where I talk about these attributes, and then I try to kind of like summarize them into a simpler workflow, which is like, okay, what does this look like in your practice room? And I'm like, cool. So, I've done this breakdown where step one is like you isolate a technical or a musical problem. Step two, you brainstorm some solutions to that and figure out how to practice it and kind of assess what might work the best. And step three is you record yourself. Like, I'm a huge advocate of self-recording, like daily. And then, of course, you want to play for other people, your teacher, colleagues. For percussion and timpani, really important to play for people who don't play percussion and timpani, right? Because they're going to be the majority of the people on our committee. You solicit all this feedback. And then, step four, you analyze that feedback and kind of determine, like, was your solution good? Does it work? Should you tweak your process? Write that down in your practice journal and repeat.
Well, and your feedback collection system I find fascinating, and maybe we would get there anyway. But can you describe? Because I think, if I remember right, you started off by dumping things into a Word document and then ultimately attaching in the iTunes lyrics.
No,
right?
I'd love to talk about that and more.
Whenever. But I'd also love to know. Just so I don't lose it in my mind, I'd love to know, because now we've got slightly different tools, right? I'd love to know, like, what you tell students to do right now in terms of just the actual nitty gritty, like, of capturing that feedback, like, and attaching it to recordings in that certain way. Like,
so this all comes from this sort of summarized workflow, right? Where so like I step through these four things, and I'm like, great. So here's your workflow, right? And just to be clear, like at this point, again, being at the Met, I've had the amazing like privilege and honor to do masterclasses like this, like all around the world. Right. And so, it has never happened where I step through that workflow and somebody's like, oh, that sounds like a stupid way to practice. Like everyone's like, yeah, no, of course. Like that's a good thing. Well, then my punchline is I take those 4 steps and then boom, I bring up the literal 4 steps of the scientific method. I'm like, this is the same. It's the same thing. Step 1, formulate a question. Step 2, formulate a hypothesis and a consequent prediction. Step 3, test, gather data, experiment. Step 4, analyze the results and document it. It's the same thing you learned like in 7th grade earth science or something, right? Yeah. So like in its most compact form, deliberate practice is just, taking the scientific method, which is a way of thinking, a way of problem solving, and applying it to the craft of music. Right now, acknowledging, of course, that that's not it, that, there's the artistic part of it, the feelings and the emotion and all of this. That's really where we need to ultimately live. Right. Like I'm always telling students, like, don't forget your job is to vibrate air at people and make them feel a thing.
Right.
Like that's what we're doing. And it's the craft that supports that. It's the craft that lets you be clear in that communication. I think of an analogy to like, imagine, an orator like John F. Kennedy having this great message to say, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. What a powerful idea, concept, right? Like what a beautiful thing to convey. But if he tried to deliver it like Bob Newhart and he's like, well, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. It's just like the delivery matters. So
that's a pretty good Bob Newhart, by the way.
Like in my mind, so that's like what this all comes down to. Like the craft refinement is about your ability to deliver your music ideas, and deliberate practice is this way you do that. And whether it's me or Dan Kreckler or anyone else who's kind of like figured out this way to think about practicing, that's kind of the things in common about it. Now, right. So what are the examples of that? How do you implement that? That's kind of what we're getting to with like this idea of that recording archive I had. In a way, I guess this kind of bounces back to one of the other questions you asked, which is like, well, how can you do this when you have a full-time job? Right. So like one of the things that was really essential for me was being efficient. right? Like making sure that my time in the practice room was really, really focused in getting good work done. But then also recognizing that there was all of this other time outside the practice room that I could be sort of carefully crafting to support those activities. And, I think intuitively we understand that exists. We know we need to like get our music together, and we need to have scores, and we need to listen. And like, there's all these other kind of complementary activities. I just kind of like went another level with it and made it like very, like systematic.
Yeah.
Right. And one of the ways I was able to do this is that, like, there's this, for anyone that doesn't know this, I mean, you're in the Bay Area now, so you probably know a lot of people who would attest to this, but there's this kind of dirty little secret among knowledge workers, tech workers, scientists, basically anybody that works at a job in a cubicle, or at least in the before times was in a cubicle.
Right.
And that is that, like, in any given workday, you might have physically been in the office for 8 to 10 hours in a given day, but you only actually did like 2 to 3 hours of work.
Right.
Or less. Like or less, or often less. Right. Yeah. And that's just the reality. And I always kind of knew that, and I experienced that. And I was sort of pleased in the last few years to see a variety of different studies and research coming out that validated that, like specifically in Cal Newport's book, Deep Work.
It's a great book.
It's a great book, right? But he talks about this, and he's like, his point is that there's like all of this untapped value because people work so inefficiently. They spend all their time doing this like kind of BS shallow work, which crowds out the time to actually be able to focus and think deliberately. And, it, like you read it, like in his book, he basically is connecting deep work and deliberate practice into this kind of unified idea.
What is your preferred time of day for that deep work? I think I remember hearing that you would practice before work. Is that your preferred time? Or I might be feel free to fact check me, but
yeah, no, that's right. I mean, I think sometimes we have our preferences, and sometimes we have like the constraints imposed by our life situation, right? It's funny because like I have never ever been a morning person ever. Like since I was a toddler, I always would prefer to stay up late. Mornings were awful for me. Getting up for school was just miserable. What's weird is that that's been changing lately in the after times now. We're like, luckily found this, affordable rental house in the Catskills outside New York City. So we've been kind of like up here riding out pandemic. But just being out in nature more, like I'm kind of adapting to like the sun up and sundown and everything. And like, I really enjoy backpacking, and I find the same thing happens when I'm just out in nature. So all of a sudden I'm like a morning person, and it's weird. But back when I was working at the nanotech company, Nano Inc., I had to just like swim upstream against my tendency, which I wanted to like sleep in until 10. But I was like, okay, dude, if you're going to do this, like you need to do this. And so I would, get up at like 5 a.m, get in a couple hours of practice before work, go to work, continue doing timpani related things at work, honestly, for 4 to 5 hours, because I was doing 2 to 3 hours of focused engineering work, cranking out results, keeping my bosses happy, publishing papers, getting patents, all that good stuff. And then just spending less time kind of screwing around. Did my timpani work there, doing work on this kind of like audio recording archive. I'll describe in a minute. And then getting back home, 5, 6 p.m., trying to knock out another couple of hours of practicing if I had the energy, and, then making dinner and, watching The Simpsons or something like that. Right. So that was kind of a typical day.
It's interesting because you're spending. I was talking to a Danish bass player maybe a year ago about all the time that he was spending on planes. He toured all over the place. I'm sure it's a little different for him right now, and he just talked about. I was talking about practicing and that kind of thing, and he was just talking about time he spent every day allotted to working on his craft, whatever that might mean. So it's interesting because you had your time in the instrument, certainly, but yeah, working on that archive, cataloging, or thinking about that's part of that. not that we're looking for a number, but, you know, to reach every day necessarily, but, you know, you were spending a large interval of your day.
Yeah. And that's interesting because for me, like, it was important to recognize too, the sort of division between these activities. Mm-hmm. And to a certain extent, this comes from some of Anders' work in deliberate practice. It comes from some other studies in performance psychology. But while there is not a fixed number, there is increasing evidence that suggests that, like, as human animals, we have some of these kind of biochemical constraints for how much we can really, really focus on a thing at a given day. And again, I think we all feel this. Like, we know kind of like when you hit the wall and you're just like, wow, I am so spent, I can't focus anymore. And you know, a lot of the research suggests that that's, you know, between 4 and 5 hours a day. And that it comes from a couple of different places. There is this buildup of a harmful protein in your brain called beta amyloid, which, if you don't sleep enough and if you're like chronically sleep deprived, sleeping is kind of what cleans that out. And if it builds up too much, then you start to become cognitively impaired. Also, this process of myelination, which is essentially insulating these neural connections so that the signals send faster and more consistently. This is kind of like the biochemical mapping of deliberate practice. And there's some research that suggests that, you know, that myelin protein itself needs to be regenerated. And so, like, as you're pushing these physical limits, that's when you start to feel that, like, hitting the wall feeling. And, you know, notably, I would highlight for people that 4 to 5 hours, you hit that wall. Listeners may remember from earlier in this that some of these operas are 5 to 6 hours long. So how the hell do you do that? Good question. Like, again, there's a lot of, like, careful design that has to go into playing around, like, with what I've kind of discovered as these physical constraints for myself. You know, just the same way. So, like, so many string players have to work to avoid repetitive, you know, use injury, and you have to figure out ways to practice to do that. It's kind of the same thing, I think, in the mental game of, like, how do I conserve bandwidth and focus and energy and all of this kind of thing. But yeah, so what that meant for me was realizing which activities were going to dramatically tax that reserve and which activities I could kind of, like, offload to more casual brain work, you know? And again, just to be clear, like, this 4 to 5 hours thing, this is something you build up over time. Some of the other research suggests that this is much more like the sort of your willpower and focus and endurance and all of this is more, it's not ingrained. It's not innate. It's more like a muscle so that you can build it up over time. And the more you use it, the better you can get. You know, just like long distance runners, right? You can, like, push this marathon time and get better and better and better. But, like, unlikely that anyone's going to be running 26.2 miles in, like, 10 minutes, right? Like, there are some obvious constraints.
Right. As I've gotten older and, you know, bass playing is some of what I do. I do many things, but I've discovered my own rhythm, my preferred, like, that 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. time. That is my window I have to guard so jealously because that is when I really feel like I make the most gains, whether it's on the bass or whether it's whatever project I'm on. That's the one that I get, that I, you know, reserve that time for. And the talent code is what comes to mind immediately when talking about myelination. I think I really learned a lot about, I think that was where I sort of discovered that concept. And I'll make sure to link up to all these books. I got a list. And I think Talent is Overrated is the book that kind of hipped you to this deliberate practice. Am I right?
Well, that was the first one I read because that was the first one that came out. Yeah. Okay. And that was the author Jeff Colvin, where my teacher, John Tafoya, one of my incredible mentors and the director of percussion at Indiana University, he had sort of graciously agreed to take me on as a private student. And so he recommended this book to me. He was basically like, hey, this thing just came out. I read it. Kind of seems right up your alley, science guy. Like, maybe you should check this out. And man, yeah, truly, that's probably the most important book I ever read in my life. Because it was the thing that finally started to help me, I guess in a way, like, it helped me see that, like, these two different facets of my work or identity or whatever were actually not that different. There was like this unifying principle between how I thought about my work in the nanotech lab and how I thought about my craft in music. And that there was this kind of false wall between them that didn't have to exist. And this was sort of the joining force of that, and like ever since then, it's been this just deep interest of mine to kind of think about the connections between how we might quantify and refine and do all this stuff at the sort of technical craft level versus how it supports the ultimate emotional expression and artistic part, right? Just like we were talking about before. And like, so for example, one thing that I we were talking about earlier, how opera and symphonic music are so different. It's like one of the things I was like, how could you quantify that? And like, you think about a famous symphonic work that has tricky fermatas, right? To me, immediately Beethoven 5 jumps to mind. Sure. This is the thing that conductors always study because, at the first rehearsal, how many conductors come in there and they're like, and it's like, and everyone's like, oh, that was a terrible cue, right? So you figure out how to like do these fermatas and come out of it. But like the fermata itself is an interesting metric of musical complexity. And so I was like, and I went back and I looked and I counted up. So the entire Beethoven's Fifth Symphony has, I'm just checking my notes, 16 fermatas throughout the entire symphony, all 4 movements. An opera like Puccini's Turandot has 137 fermatas. So like these works obviously feel very different. Puccini's style is different than Beethoven's style. The message of the opera is one thing, and sort of the abstract, humanist ideas that sort of infuse Beethoven symphonies. That like, so there's all of this artistic stuff, but then at just this basic level, I'm like, all right, so to learn this damn thing, I got to be aware that these are different in their structure and mechanics,
Mm-hmm. It's funny. It just popped into my mind. George Solti with the Chicago Symphony. He would start Beethoven 5. He would give 4 beats. He'd go 1, 2, 3, 4, which is unusual, but it works.
Effective. You do what you got to do. Yeah. No, totally. Well, and it was funny too because like as you were talking about how you were like you preciously guard your 7 to 10 a.m. time.
Yeah.
This reminded me of another thing about like the famous luminaries of the past, whether conductors or composers or anyone. And I forget which book this was. It was maybe The Talent Code. It was maybe Bounce by Matthew Syed. One of these. It was exploring sort of the different stories and or built up myths about these famous greats. And one of them talked about how like I think a lot of people still even to this day will. When confronted with this idea, if I just make the statement, guys, innate talent is a myth, they're like, wait a minute, but how do you explain Einstein and how do you explain Mozart? And I'm like, yeah, like Mozart's actually a really good case study for this because, like his father Leopold got him to work when he was 4 years old, basically pimping him out all over Europe to pay the bills. So Mozart, like little Wolfie, was doing like way more than 3 or 4 hours a day of practice every day. He was doing this like constantly every day. And yet, like most musicologists will point to like the mid sort of Kerschel 400 era as like the evolution of his mature style. And that was still like, years before the true genius works of like Cosi and Nozze and Don Giovanni and all these things. Right. So, you look at that and you're like, okay, cool. So that Mozart was about 28 when he started writing in this, middle period of mature style. Dude was doing deliberate practice for 24 years before he ever cranked out anything that like history was going to bother to remember. Yeah. And, to me, that's like this idea that, I definitely consider Mozart a genius, but it was not gifted. It was earned. And you see that same pattern again and again and again in painters and artists and composers and everybody. And, there's a lot of really interesting sort of journals about composers like Mahler or Strauss or Sibelius that had this like very defined daily routine. They were like, I get up and take my breakfast at 6:30, and then I go to my composing hut in the woods, and I compose from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. And then I take my morning coffee, and then I go on a walk, and then I come back. And it's like, it is totally the opposite of like so much of the sort of like romantic myth of like just waiting around for inspiration, and then the muse strikes, and then you work for 48 hours straight and jam it. It's like, that's not how it works. That's not how the process really works. You've got to guard that time. You got to figure out when you're like able to focus, and then you just do it. And like some days you're going to do it and it's not going to be great. And other days you'll do it and you'll make real progress, and you'll either, none of this moves in a straight line, right? Like there's pits and valleys and plateaus, and it happens on the craft of our instrument. And it happens if you're composing an opera or a symphony or a sonnet or anything else. And the kind of key is you just have to keep at it.
Well, and what you're describing is what separates amateurs from professionals, right? Professionals show up even when they don't want to. They sit down in that chair at 7 a.m. or whatever, and that's that you're working like a professional. And we're talking about professional practicing, treating practice in a professional way. I mean, in my mind, it's interesting because I've done two very quick stories. When I was a high school orchestra conductor, I had a commute of 35 miles. I was teaching in Vernon Hills, Illinois. I was living in the Loop like a fool, but it's my wife. My wife was at the University of Chicago, so it was our compromise. And
do what you got to do.
And I had 3 rehearsals a day. Very good orchestra program. And I had my phone with me all the time. I just started recording rehearsals, and I would listen to them on my commute home, just for fun, just on a lark. I would record them in Evernote, and I would listen on my way home. And the depressing thing is, I would often get through all of my rehearsals, and I would still be in the car. So I had relived my entire actual workday. But you know what started to happen? I started to become such a better conductor and teacher because I was listening to everything from the bloody first read through with the freshman orchestra to like working on, Benvenuto Cellini Overture or something like that. And I started to flesh out, and I started to take some notes, and I started to share with the students some of those recordings, and I started to create an archive. Nothing nearly like what I've heard you describe. But then I also, in my own practicing in recent years, I had been very much an amateur practicer the last couple decades until about 2-3 years ago when I discovered this app, Modacity, Mark Gelfand, that I was talking about. And I started using it just because I was going to interview him, but I started to get into the gamification of practicing, kind of like, because that app, it's all built around deliberate practice. And I'll tell you, it's funny. I have days where it's like, oh, I'm getting things done, I'm not getting things done. But that app, it makes it very easy to save recordings and tie them to that specific piece. And I remember maybe a year ago, I'd been working on this piece, and I started to go back and I started to listen to what was it like a year ago? What was it like 6 months ago? What was it like? What were my notes on this? What were my notes on that? And to start to track my progress. And so what your system or what you've described just resonates so strongly with me because I love the objectivity that, and Sam, you were talking, I think, about students, how students seem to want to work on the fluffy stuff, when they haven't really done the work. And I just think it's a really interesting concept.
Well, no, that's a great segue. And there's a lot to unpack there. But okay, so first of all, yes, the progression part of it, huge, right? Like absolutely huge. And again, I got to emphasize, like, none of this like sprang fully formed into my mind. Like this was an organic evolution over probably like 2007 to 2010, where I was like just kind of making this up as I went along. But it, partly because there wasn't anything else quite out there yet like this. There, Mark's app didn't exist and whatever. So I was kind of like in this place where necessity is the mother of invention. But the way it evolved, I'm going to describe that, but I want to bookmark 2 of the huge ideas here that I think it demonstrates, because again, I didn't know at the time it was doing this, but the reason it was such a useful tool for me was that a core concept of deliberate practice is continuous feedback, right? Mm-hmm. That you have to know whether what you're doing is making a difference or not. There's this famous quote that practicing without feedback is like bowling through a curtain.
Yeah, I love that.
Like you never, you don't know if you're getting any better, and you stop caring, right? And so you've got to know, like if you picture this like a journey or an expedition. Like it doesn't take too much getting off track on the compass heading before like you end up, in a fever swamp versus like your destination, right? So like you need to have your own like little internal Google Maps navigator being like, no, turn left. No, I said turn left, right? So that's one thing. That's what the feedback part of it accomplishes. Another big part of it is like you said, the being able to measure your own progress. Mm-hmm. which has a lot of dimensions to it. But I mean, one of them is just, for me, it was kind of purely emotional, right? Because like any musician will have days where they're in the practice room and they're like, oh my God, what is going on? I'm such a hack. I feel like I've spent like 10 years practicing and it's still like this. This is all worthless. I haven't gotten anywhere. Like, it can feel at times like you haven't made any progress at all. Mm-hmm. But for me, like, having this recorded archive where, again, like, I would be able to check in on the same thing. So like one of the most frequently requested timpani excerpts of all time is like the coda of Beethoven 9 first movement. And, being able to listen to that from my recording in 2008 and then like 6 months later and 3 months after that, and then having a list of like 20 of these things spanning, 7 years, that's really incredible to hear. Right. And it, for me, it was really important in reminding me like kind of what the point of all of this was. The point, again, not being I'm attaching my life's worth to some sort of outcome I can't control. Rather, I'm like focusing on my process. What is this process? The process looks and sounds like this like continual climb up this mountain that has no limit or end goal, where you're basically, I'm going to throw a geometry word in there, but you're like asymptotically approaching perfection, which is unreachable, right? Like perfect doesn't exist. Like, we're always just trying to refine, but there's no end to that. And having this resource where I could like hear that was happening very objectively and be like, wow, that first recording from 2007, now I hear it and it sounds like total amateur hour, right? But that's okay. That's a measure of my progress. In fact, it has to be that way. And I have to remind myself that like back then, that was my best, and I could and should have been justifiably proud of that. And what happened along the way was that I got pickier and I got better. And my concept for all of this stuff evolved, and that's the process working. So when you can have that sort of like meta level of feedback, like this evidence that the process is working, just like super, super critical. And then, so what did this actually look like, right? Well, you're talking about the gamification of this, and I love that because, I talk about with my students sometimes that there are elements of this that are a lot like a role playing game, Yeah. I will freely admit that I spent many weeks in March and April of this year, like as the world was completely shutting down. I was like, okay, this is nuts, but I've been wanting to play Zelda Breath of the Wild for a long time. So I think I'm just going to get into that. And, like there are these elements of commonality between like just getting in the practice room and grinding away and like leveling up. And you do this and you finally unlock this one thing. You're like, oh man, my left hand never used to be able to do that, but now I can do this thing, or I have better control. I can do a roll, or, my hands are now moving this fast. I have the master sword, like that's kind of the gamification of it. But again, like when you can have the much more tangible evidence of that rather than just this sort of like abstract thing, it's really valuable. I think a lot about how much, here's a little thought experiment, or maybe exercise from one Jason to another.
Sure.
How much of your life right now is documented, right? Between emails, texts, Zoom hangs that may or may not be recorded, GPS coordinates that Google is tracking, social media things, your web browser history, right? Like there's so much of this that's being documented.
Right.
And can help you, if you need to, like reconstruct, like what were you doing 3 years ago on a Tuesday? Well, let me go check my Google Calendar. Oh, I got my notes in there. Okay, cool. But lacking some of this approach to practicing, like we make these sounds and it dissipates into the air and that's it. Like it can just feel extremely ephemeral, right?
Yeah, that's a great analogy, by the way. I love that analogy. I mean, I think about it. So like, I've got my fitness tracker on right here. I've got my Google Maps. How often do I refer back to my calendar and look at those notes? That's a wonderful way to frame practicing.
Well, and again, for like the fourth time, this sounds like really thought out, but at the time it totally wasn't. At the time I was just like making this up. But,
Right.
But why? The reason I started doing it this way is it was as simple as like the way I was doing it was really dumb. And so it started with this thing where I had these like 3-ring binders full of all of my timpani excerpt music. Mm-hmm. And I was bringing it around to lessons and taking it into the practice room with me and studying. And like, so all of this, you know, these loose leaf pieces of paper were living inside these plastic sheet protectors. And I was working on this, and I'd take a lesson, and I'd like do some chicken scratch on there and all this other stuff. And then, you know, so I was kind of accumulating the evidence of my work was accumulating that way. And, you know, then one time I flew to an audition, and I got to the hotel, and like I couldn't find my binder. And I like had a freaking aneurysm. I was like, oh my, like, you know,
sure.
Like, and luckily I had just misplaced it, and it like fell behind, you know, the desk or something like that. But, but that was this moment where I was like, oh my, Jesus, like what would I do if I like lost all that? All this work would be gone. And then sort of in tandem, I was having this thing where like over about a year and a half, you know, I was studying with a variety of different people, and I was playing mocks, and I started to run out of literal room on the music to write. So then I started putting like Post-it notes on top of the sheet protector. And it was like, you know, maybe aim for a slightly slower target tempo. Like, you know, for Beethoven 7, maybe like 102 instead of 106. And okay, maybe try the mallet with this covering instead of the other. But okay, but no, actually change my mind in this room. So, and it started to be this like stack of Post-it notes, one on top of the other, until it was like this ridiculous, like archaeological dig. And I felt like opening up my music was like, you know, going into Rome and like finding the, you know, evidence of the Etruscans or something. And I was like, damn it. I was like, this is insane. This is not a smart way to be working. I was like, Self, you're an engineer, for God's sakes. Like you can do better than this. And so I started trying to brainstorm ways to like have, you know, some version of a working archive. And so what it became was this idea. I mean, so you were asking about the tools that people have now, right? Mm-hmm. I wouldn't, you know, pretend to say that this thing I came up with is currently the best or only way to do it. Like what interests me more is like the attributes of this and like what does it satisfy?
Sure,
right.
Of course.
So what I needed it to be satisfying was a way to organize like hundreds, if not thousands, of recordings, both, you know, MP3s and MP4s doing audio and video. A way to have relevant notes in there of, you know, decisions I'd made, sort of like the chronological story of this, right? Because what I found so frustrating was that I would go back to my binder and I'd be like, wait a minute, but what tempo is it? Which stick did I decide on? And it was like reinventing the wheel every time. And it was just really inefficient and dumb, especially if it was a, you know, and we all have this, right? Like every instrument has their excerpts where it's like, these are the top excerpts you're always being asked to play in prelims. And then there's like that one that was on that list in like 1998 that like you need to know. And like you play for a teacher like every 18 months or something. But like every time you come back to it, you're kind of dusting it off. Right. Mm-hmm. And I should say, just like incidentally, that even to this day, I'm using this archive system, and it's super useful because, you know, if a student comes in and brings one of these rare excerpts to play, I don't want to be in this position where I'm like bullshitting them and being like, oh yeah, you know, just do this. And but like, I would much rather be like, going to be honest with you, I just don't remember like my decisions on this that thoroughly. It's been a while, but give me 30 seconds. I'm going to dive into my little archive. I'm going to watch my video of it, skim it quick, and then boom, it all comes like right back as if it was yesterday. And so this system is kind of working to accomplish a lot of these things. I ended up putting it in iTunes because for me, that was at the time kind of the most efficient way to organize the media. Other people I know have something like you were talking about, like in Evernote. You can have it in a Google spreadsheet and link to things. Like there's a variety of ways to accomplish it. But ultimately, it became this archive where, as I was going through practice sessions, getting ready for an audition, sort of, you know, getting ready for a mock, I would put in all of this work on this sort of, you know, recurring set of material. And I would get to a point where I felt like, you know, that run I just had that I recorded, that might be my best yet. Cool. Okay. That might be evidence of progress. Let me compare this to my previous best. So I often think of like, Olympic runners in like the 100-meter dash. It's like, okay, cool. Do we have a new world record? Like, let's go to the tape. Let's compare,
Yeah.
And I would sit and I would like listen and toggle back and forth. And I was listening like according to some of these very specific parameters, which is like, okay, for the last 2 weeks, I've been hammering away at like hand-to-hand consistency, and are the notes speaking, and like is the intonation super crystal clear? Is the phrasing like, evident but still nuanced and not like beating people over the head, like all, whatever my working list was of stuff that I was trying to refine. And I had a benchmark against which to compare it. And then I could sort of reach some decision point, which was either like, yeah, no, this is like definitely legitimately an improvement. And then that would become the new best and sort of like kick the old one out and like, here we are. Or it's like, I was a little delusional today. I was feeling like really great, but it turns out I have this like irrefutable evidence that it's not up to standard yet. So gonna keep going, But so what this created over time was this archive of like, hundreds of different excerpts in the different excerpts themselves, which then had sort of the children among them, which was like, we've got Beethoven 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then into the archive, you're like, right. And we've got like 35 different versions of Beethoven 1 spanning time. And you can kind of listen to it and assess it in all of these different ways. So that was kind of the idea.
And then you would use the lyrics tab to put the notes, right? Which I think is a really cool. I just like the idea of how one binds these video or audio recordings together with that feedback. I think that's so valuable. And I've certainly been in that situation of like, oh crap, where's my binder? My like treasured things going back from 1994, and so I'm just fascinated. And I remember having a conversation along slightly similar topics with Rob Knopper, talking about kind of like approaching things like as a portfolio. Like I think he had a different system. I think it was paper maybe at that point, but it's just really interesting how one. So were you just super nerdy questions? But I'm just interested. So were you creating separate playlists in iTunes, like a Mozart 35 playlist, and then they were like organized within that, like?
Yeah, well, so I guess a couple of the reasons that I gravitated toward doing it in iTunes and have stuck with it that way. Again, I think there's a lot of ways to accomplish this.
Sure.
And to be totally clear, like I kind of stole this idea from John Tafoya, my teacher. Mm-hmm. Like he wasn't doing this exact thing, but there was one lesson I'll never forget where he described like, he was like, Jason, it seems like you don't have your intention super clear with this when you're trying to play it. He's like, when I sit down to play an excerpt, I'm imagining in my mind, I'm like on my Mac, and there's like, you click the menu and then there's like this drop down, and then there's like submenus and submenus. And the drop downs have to do with, the target tempo and the inflection and the phrasing and the style and like all of these things. And you have it there in advance before you even play a note. And at this time, I had started doing the thing which I wish I had started way earlier, which was recording all my lessons. Because, good God, like, we spent all of our time with these great teachers, and I like wanted to capture and recapture that value. And so, kind of like you were describing before, I was driving back from the lesson. It's like a 5-hour drive down to Bloomington, Indiana, and I was listening to it, and we got back to this point, and I was just like, oh, duh, yeah. Seriously, I need to be better about that. How can I like really manifest that idea? And so that became this thing of like having within the lyrics tab sort of the complete story of what I was doing, and organizing it such that it was clear like what were my top level decisions, what was like the most recent decision I had gotten to, and more importantly, why, But again, not just the technical stuff. Like, what is my artistic vision for this? What am I trying to communicate? What do I want to leave the listener feeling when I'm done playing? All of that. And the reason I opted for a media organizer versus a text organizer linked to media is simply because, like, in my mind, again, at the end of the day, while all of the craft and the technical stuff and this and the text and the decisions, while that's all essential, it's supportive.
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, the product, the thing we're really going for is the sound. Like, and so if I had to choose between, give me 30 seconds to refresh on this before a lesson, and I can either, watch the video of me doing it or quick read my list of things, I'm going to watch the video every time, because that's going to remind me of everything I was doing, in that sort of like picture worth 1,000 words kind of way.
That really resonates with me, organizing it like that. That's a super cool way to do it. And I, the chaos and the emotion of the moment versus the journey and the objective feedback you get, whether it's your career or not. I've said this on the podcast before, but it's so much easier to look in the rearview mirror, right? And to see this neat and orderly tale. My life feels like chaos. I have no idea what's happening, still does. And I think that's everybody's. And I feel, I go on a roller coaster with my playing too and everything, but what does not lie, and it's just interesting how little people I've chatted with and students I've worked with do track things like we're describing in their practicing, versus just how much of your life, like you said, is documented with my text messages, with my wife and friends, and my email archive and my calendar and everything. And that recording thing, that's something that you brought up right at the beginning of your last chat with Noah, a Bulletproof Musician, about like, why don't people, like, it should be that the value of that session that you have with a person for whatever interval of time, like getting the most out of that, how critical that is. And like, I'm always sort of surprised when people don't ask to record sessions with me, because and then you as the student, I mean, having those multiple passes, right? You have the in-person experience, then you have, like for you, driving back from Bloomington, listening to it. And then if I remember right, you would transcribe, or either all of it or to an extent, right? Too, like actually write down.
100%. Yeah, like a court reporter.
And then the beautiful thing about that, which I think you brought up in Noah's art, but is then that becomes searchable, right? And so when you're looking up something, and that's something that I've discovered with this podcast. I actually have with a wonderful woman named Krista Copper who goes through and doesn't transcribe all of these, but she puts all the topics we talk about and timestamps them. Over the 730 episodes or whatever we're at on this podcast, if I just type spiccato, I could find, and so I've put together these highlight episodes spanning 13 years of people talking about spiccato. So take that and direct that to your playing, and the value of that is just astonishing.
It's interesting because there was this other podcast interview thing that I recorded like back in January. Now it was a while ago, but it was this really interesting guy he lives in France. His name is Baptiste, and we were talking about some of these ideas about like technology and tools and like what all of this is and like how we incorporate it, right? And I thought there were some really interesting ideas that we got into there that have a direct bearing on this, because especially now it's so easy to kind of take the dichotomy view of like technology is evil and it created this system and it's bringing down the Western world, and social media is destroying democracy and all of this stuff. And like there are very powerful arguments in favor of that.
Right.
But being a scientist and somebody who is working on technology, I also have to say like, well, yeah, but wait a minute. We also, cured polio and did all this other stuff. It's a double-edged sword. Mm-hmm. And so much of what I think, again, going back to Cal Newport, like what he writes about so persuasively and thoughtfully is we incorporate these tools with agency, or we should. Mm-hmm. Like the idea is not, that you bring some sort of technology tool into your musicianship and it turns you into a soulless robot. Like, no. It is you do it with thoughtfulness and agency so that you can better refine your craft and be a better emotional communicator, like however that's going to go. Mm-hmm. And whether it's, using this technology to record your lessons, or being able to have this powerful searchable database of podcasts that you've, conducted, or any of these things like that, it's sort of like using those powers for good instead of evil.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Like this phone is simultaneously the best and worst thing to ever happen to my life,
Totally.
Depending on how responsible I am with it. But the positives are vast, like having that archive accessible, like you're describing, or the other things we've been talking about.
Well, and I think the key is doing it with thought, like with intention, right? Like the whole point of Cal Newport's book, Digital Minimalism, is not all technology is evil. It's that just make sure that however you're doing it, whatever you're engaging with, you are doing with intention, with a purpose, not just because, wow, I spent like 5 hours on Instagram today somehow, and I don't know where that went. And like, I couldn't get anything done because I was getting like 12 different notifications from 7 different messaging apps and all this other, like, that is an unthoughtful approach to incorporating technology and drives you insane. Right. And so like, and to, I'm not definitely not trying to shame anyone here, because I'm in the same boat as everybody else. Like, we are very much swimming upstream in the year 2020, where very powerful companies like Apple and Google and Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all these different entities are working to monetize our attention. Like that is their business model.
Right.
And whether or not you call that evil or not, like, this is the world as it is. And a lot of Newport's argument is like, just recognize that the economy we live in is one in which your attention has been monetized, and you need to sort of take that back and establish your agency for how you spend that attention. And if you can spend it in ways, again, working on your craft, being in the practice room, listening to podcasts, like however that goes, if you can do that with intention and thoughtfulness, you can kind of carve this middle path between like an over hyper-stimulated, like going nuts techno person, or like an ascetic monk in the woods. There's a middle way we can live. Yeah, for sure. That's my personal thing. I've just fallen into the last few years is check email twice a day, get something done before that first check, in and out as quickly as possible. I got a whole system to get that has seemed to work well, because all the various projects I have going on, you have going on, we all have going on. I mean, it's death by 1,000 cuts. If we're not careful, and just making sure that I eat that frog first thing in the morning, that I do whatever and that changes day to day, but I'm always fascinated by workflow and by how people document what they do and grow. And I mean, I just find you're like such an inspiring story. You have like one of the most compelling stories. I'm pretty sure it was Mark Gelfo that hit me to what you were doing. And I feel so fortunate to have found your articles. I was preparing to do a talk on practicing. I think it was called Teach Your Students How to Practice or something like that. It was a teacher in service in Seattle. And then I'm like, oh, this is amazing. And then I did another talk at TMEA, the Music Education Conference in Texas, on practicing. And so I was just like, I had already been planning the talk. I was way into the talk, and then I was like, oh, I need to rethink a lot of what I've done. So I'm really digging. Man, I have so many things I want to talk with you about. I want to be respectful of your time. I want to do another 90 minutes on just like, I've got all these education questions I'd be fascinated to add, and what you think but dude, let's do it. Part 2. We'll get it on
perfect,
the books.
Because I've got, let's please do it. And you, my friend, should start a podcast. It would be so great. I'll send folks to your website. Where else do you want people to go? I'll link up to everything we've talked about. We'll have a great book
that'd be
list.
awesome. Yeah, all these resources should be things people can find. It's and again, it's just kind of all out there so people can help themselves. And I guess if there's one bit of like shameless self-promotion, I'll indulge for a second.
Please.
I honestly spent like a good chunk of April and May, like so many other musicians in the world, just being like, oh, what the hell? Like, what are we going to do? What's happening here? But through that process, I arrived at this idea where for the past few summers, I had been doing this, in-person seminar on specifically deliberate practice, on all of the stuff that we've been talking about. And, stepping through all of these attributes and then trying to show people some examples of like how you can incorporate it in your own process so people could have some real tangible like takeaway skills. And we'd been doing that in person, and it was growing, and it was really great, and it was fun, and I felt like, yes, this is exactly the kind of teaching I love and want to be doing more of. And then, of course, the world fell apart, but I was like, okay, maybe there's a way I could do this online. Like the Zoom platform is imperfect, but it's what we have to deal with. So like maybe there's a way we can do this. And I was committed to like making it really accessible and like affordable for folks. Cause my God, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Like musicians don't have like tens of thousands of dollars to spend on other things. So I set it up as a pay what you can model, with all proceeds being donated to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and artistrelief.org. And it's just called the Deliberate Practice Bootcamp online. You can just find it on my website. There's an easy link there. But the cool thing is like, I posted about it online, and the response was like totally overwhelming. Like it was really inspiring to see how many people signed up. So many, in fact, that I had to like the first session filled up, and I had to create a second session, and now we're on the way to filling that up. So I'm just going to keep creating more sessions as people get into it. But I was also like, just a shout out to all the folks out there that are like volunteering to pay full price for it too. Again, I know like a lot of people are struggling, but the idea is that any of this is going to go to help other good causes. And so like, I applaud those folks who have the means to do that, and thank them. And I'll just, I'd be happy. Anybody listening to this that wants to join up, I'll be happy to work with you.
I love it. Yeah, I saw that on your site. I will. That's great that you're doing that. I'll make sure to link up to that. And a lot of people, I've been talking about deliberate practice off and on for the last few years, and so I know that a lot of people have downloaded Modacity, which if you like that app, you'll love getting deeper into that with Jason. Thanks, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Jason, you rock. And as we covered at the end, Jason is running these deliberate practice boot camps. There's one that has started. If you're listening to this the moment it comes out, this was day one. So my bad on not timing this out to get out a little earlier. But he's going to be running another one later in the fall. I've got that linked up in the show notes, or just go to jasonhaaheim.com and you'll get the info on that. What a cool concept, this boot camp. And also, this is the only time that I have had a guest on, and I realized we have so much more to talk about that I actually did another interview with him before this one even came out. So this is coming out on the August 24th, I think. And on the 19th, maybe something like that, we did another interview mostly focused around education, because his path through the music to his job is just super interesting. I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned about what is school for? What is music school for? Is music school something that we should be doing? Yes or no? And there are no easy answers to any of this, but it was a conversation that I thought would be useful for people to hear, and particularly useful to hear from someone like Jason and then someone like me, who we don't really have a horse in this race. Neither of us teach at academic institutions. And so look forward to that. I think it explores a lot of interesting territory. Neither of us are trying to tell anybody what to do, but just share our experiences and what we've observed. So, boy, did I have a great time with this conversation. I hope you did as well. You might very well be new to the podcast, and if you look at this episode number, you probably realize, wow, there are a lot of old podcasts. So how the heck do you even dig into this catalog of 13 years and I don't even know how many hours? It's insane. 700 plus episodes. Well, a good way to do it, if it seems overwhelming, which I understand. And if you're not a bassist, which you might very well not be, and you might think, I don't want to hear a lot about bass. Well, the dirty little secret of this podcast is really most of the episodes have topics more like what we talk about today, bass is just kind of a convenient frame to I'm a bassist. I'm talking mostly, I guess we'll say, with bassists, but certainly we're exploring things way outside of bass. So don't be scared by the name. Maybe I should have picked a different name back 13 years ago. Too late. But feel free to just join in the stream of content we put out. But if you want to dig down and try to learn a little bit more about specific topics like auditioning or deliberate practice or whatever, I'd recommend downloading the app. Contrabass Conversations, search for it in your app store of choice. We're on iOS, Android, Kindle, and that's got a great search engine. And you just start typing a topic, and any episode that we talked about will pop up. You can then download those episodes directly to the app. You can favorite them. You can do all sorts of different things. It's a very convenient way to dig into the archives if you're looking for something specific. And I try to go wide on this podcast. I took a bit of Tim Ferriss's advice. Tim Ferriss, wonderful podcast. You may or may not listen to him. Look him up if you're interested. But Tim says he's trying to hit on something every episode that will be fascinating to like 10 to 20% of his audience. And I like that idea. So whether it's talking about looping and pedals and something very like maybe even more electric bass world but that's still going to be extremely interesting to a lot of double bassists who double, or these things can be applied to double bass. Here we're talking about deliberate practice and how it could be worked into a very successful path towards winning an audition. Obviously, that's probably not going to apply to someone who's an adult amateur who picked up the bass and wants to play in a bluegrass group, but there's still lessons. But I would hope that all of these would be at least somewhat interesting to everybody. Don't know why I'm going on so long about my philosophy, but apparently I am. And I like to try to create something that's extremely interesting to a core group of people and would hopefully be somewhat interesting to everybody. I'm not trying to go super general. I'm trying to go specific and then just kind of rotate around the specificity. So that's kind of what I try to do. The app is a good way to get in if you want to find those things that you're probably intensely interested in. But I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you making it to the end here. That means you're into this, or you're in a situation where you can't turn me off and go to another show. Regardless, thank you so much. If you want to reach out, feedback at contrabassconversations.com is a great way to get in touch. And I respond to each and every email. I love hearing if you just want to say hi, or if you have an idea for a topic or a guest, that would be great. If you're not on our email list, we send out weekly email about what's going on in the bass world. That's definitely more bass specific, but we have a lot of non-bass players on there too, and I would be honored to have a place in your inbox. So you can sign up at contrabassconversations.com/email, or you'll see ways to do it if you go to our website. No problem at all. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, Mitch Mooring, and Krista Copper, and Mitch Mooring makes quite the bass. In Kilgore, Texas, just east of Dallas, Fort Worth. Look him up on mitchmooring.com, and he won a silver award for tone at the last International Society of Bassists Convention, and I love his basses. They're super cool. I've played several of them, and he's just doing fantastic work. I'm your host, Jason Heath. Thank you for making it to the end if you made it this far, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.